Hello, my name is Wolfgang Herbert. I will make a lecture about the history of the art of tattooing in Japan. I'm professor at the University of Tokushima for Comparative Cultural Studies. My subjects are the margins of society, discrimination, the underworld. I also practice and study martial arts, and one of my subjects I deal with is tattooing. I have lived in Japan for more than 30 years, and I came into contact with tattooing almost instantly when I came here via a tattoo artist named Horitsune II, and we will see some of his works later, and I will talk about him again. And first of all, you might be aware that tattoos in Japan are actually looked upon not very favorable, if not to say people who are tattooed are discriminated at. The image of tattoos is pretty low, which is astonishing given that the artistic level of Japanese tattoos is extremely high. This has, of course, historical and other reasons, and we will delve into that later. Just as an illustration, I give you some data, which means there were a few polls where people were asked. They had multiple choice answer possibilities, and one of these polls was made by the by lawyers, and it is from 2014, and there were more than 1,000 people between 20 and 70 asked, and for instance, one of the answers were if they would tolerate if somebody in their own family would be tattooed, and there were 55% who said that would be absolutely intolerable. Yurusenai is the term in Japanese. And the same goes if you generally ask them about what you think about people who are tattooed. So again, around half of them would say that they don't tolerate it. The funny thing is that we as foreigners are a bit better off. So if you are asked if they feel it something different, if it is a Japanese or a foreigner who is tattooed, and they say in about 10% it's the same, and interestingly, as far as Japanese are concerned, only 0.4% would answer I do not mind, but almost a third would say I don't mind if it is a foreigner. Another question was, what do you associate with the term tattoo if you hear that? And actually there were 47.5% who would instantly associate crime with it, or the term. It was given in Japanese outlaw, was named by more than half of the people. 24%, almost a fourth, would say it associated with art, matsuri, which are festivals, or fashion. And yes, and in respect of showing tattoos in public, it was 2/3 who answered this is not tolerable. And most of them would say that certain restrictions are in place. And we have another poll which was conducted by the ministry that is transport and infrastructure, and also tourism, and they sent out a questionnaire to hotels and traditional Japanese inns, ryokan, and other institutions or establishments which have thermal springs or baths, and it was asked how they deal with people who are tattooed when they want to use these public baths, and 56% answered categorically that they don't let them in. But there was also almost a third of those establishments which answered they do not mind and have no restrictions at all. So the thing is that now, due to corona, we don't know if it really will be held, but because of the Olympics that were planned to be held in Tokyo in 2020, and shortly before there were the World Championships in rugby, and you know that rugby players from New Zealand, for instance, are pretty heavily tattooed, and also the people who come in order to watch, and tourism is boosted in Japan, and many young foreigners who are tattooed come to the country, and now they are thinking about how shall we deal with this taboo, how shall we deal with foreigners who want to use a bath or something. And actually you can find instructions or reflections in the homepage of the Ministry for Infrastructure and so on forth, and Tourism. I will show it here in Japanese, and shortly. This is actually what you find in the homepage, and you can see with the photos here that they say that it would be one possibility to just patch them up so that the tattoos are not shown. And there are not quite a few of public baths who offer these patches for free. Another option that is given is that they reserve certain hours for those who are tattooed, or if they have the possibility to offer facilities that are only for tattooed people, so they are separated from the others. So you can see that there is a rethinking of the history of tattooing and how tattoos are seen by people in the going. There was also a court case which is quite curious. A young tattooist called Masada Taiki. He was fined 300,000 yen because he, as it was stated, did a medical procedure. And this is a very far-reaching interpretation of a guidance, and just a guidance of the Ministry of Health and Welfare, in which it was stated that in 2001, inserting pigment into the skin using a needle is a medical practice. So he went against this ruling, and he actually won. So the thing is that in the end, tattooing was kind of accepted or vindicated as a normal work. And I mean, there are no real regulations, and the point is the world of the tattooists. I know a few young tattooists, and I spoke with them. They are 50-50. The ones say, well, this ruling is good for us because the police cannot so easily clamp down on our trade anymore. The others say, once the state comes in and they start to regulate the business, it might be in many respects it might be more restricted than it is now, and it's easier or better for them to operate, no pun intended, in a grey zone. So, why are tattoos not so positively looked at in Japan? As a Japanologist, let me start with the terminology, and with that we can go back into history, and you can see that tattooing has a long history, not only in Japan but particularly also in China. And indeed there are a few characters, Chinese characters, that are associated with the tattoo needle, and we know that in Japan people have been tattooed as a corporal punishment. This was introduced from China, and it was abolished in the 13th century and re-established in the 18th century in 1720 by Shogun Yoshimune for petty crimes. And usually the people were literally branded either on their arms or on their forehead. But this practice is very, very old, as is shown in certain Chinese characters, where you can see that people were branded in their face, and the tattoo needle is part of the kanji of the Chinese character used in the Japanese language, and this has been applied onto criminals, but also is thought that it was a sign of being a slave or forced laborer. And well, the tattoo as a punishment has the problematic side effect that it is, of course, immediately associated with criminals, and that's one of the reasons why tattoos are seen in a negative way in Japan. It's not the only one. Going back into that part of the history, we can see that the oldest evidences in Japan are from the Yayoi period. It was a Chinese historiographic compilation called Wajingishi in Japanese, and they talk about the Japanese people being tattooed. It's thought that it was maybe to ward off bad demons. That was very common also in many other kanji that are actually associated with the tattoo needle. We can see that it was applied as a sort of rite de passage, so birth and growing up, becoming a officially an adult, and after death were occasions when tattoos, possibly only painting, was applied, and usually in order to ward off bad spirits and things like that. And well, in the oldest semi-mythological compilations, Nihon Shoki and the Kojiki, the custom of tattooing is actually mentioned, and we have also the terms that are mentioned for that. You can find it in the material I have appended, and we can see that these are tattoos inflicted in the face. And then in the Taiho Code it was abolished, re-established 2 times, abolished again, of course, in the Meiji period, where tattooing as such was prohibited. And the history of Japanese tattoos actually starts, let's say, in the Edo period, between 1603 and 1867 or 8, when the Meiji Restoration took place, and the country was opened to foreign ships. What happened? So, the first tattoos we know of were very small, and they were limited to entertainment areas, red light districts, brothels, and places like this. And one of them was a small little, let's call it a beauty point, inserted about here, so when two lovers were greeting each other, they could touch these little ink spots, and this was called ire okuro. There were others where the courtesan, for instance, tattooed the name of her favorite lover or patron into her arm, and it was there was also the kanji for inochi, I give my life to you, which can be prolonged very much ideographically. And we have quite a few of woodblock prints and other allusions in the literature about courtesans or other women who were desperate to erase or otherwise conceal these tattoos because the lover was long gone. And this is still one thing. Horitsune, for instance, the tattooist who became my friend, he said he would never tattoo the name of a lover into someone's body because you will certainly regret it. And well, these were very small beginnings. We have scattered sources talking about tattoos on the back of a monk with religious inscriptions, mantras, for instance, like Namu Amida Butsu and stuff like that. But the tattoos were still on a very limited scale. So the big happening was the Chinese, let's call it a novel, it's a book called Suiko Den in Japanese. And Pearl S. Bach made an English version, and he named it All Men Are Brothers. Usually it's translated as The Water Margin, because the heroes of this novel, they lived in a marsh. They were rebels, they were renegades, they were criminals on the run, bandits, all kind of outcasts and outlaws who assembled there. And in the original there are 4 of those 108 heroes who are described as having big tattoos on their bodies. Every one of these heroes had their certain gifts or special abilities, be it the use of a certain weapon or being enormously immune against alcohol and stuff like that. Very entertaining stories. And this Suikoden was translated into Japanese, and first, well, as an exercise to learn some classical Chinese, and by some Confucian scholars in Japan. And when the first 10 chapters came out, it was an instant bestseller. And you have to think of Edo, of the now Tokyo, the capital of Japan at the time, had almost 1 million inhabitants, was the biggest town in the world at the time, I think. And what is more, it had a very, very high literacy rate. And because in Japan there also books circulate which are written in kana, this is a syllable scripture that is easy to learn, there are many people who were able to read. And these books, particularly when they got popular, they were usually illustrated. And they were illustrated by wood blocks. And one of the editions that was on the market was actually illustrated by Hokusai, who is an eminent woodblock printer. Everybody knows him. And we will have a look at these prints in a moment. The most famous of these woodblock printers who illustrated the Suikoden is Utagawa Kuniyoshi. He reputedly was tattooed himself, and he actually expanded the number of the heroes who are reported to be tattooed into 20, and his woodblocks were enormously popular, and indeed the Suikoden went through several editions, plus there were indigenous versions, there were versions where the heroes were women, and so on and so forth. So that was a big Suikoden craze. And given the illustrations in them, I will show them soon. I've got the prints here. There were the people who saw this and wanted the same thing on their skin. So let's have a look at the prints, or some of the prints that were done by Utagawa. So this is, for instance, a very famous hero called Kumon Ryu Shishin. Kumon is Kumon Ryu, 9 dragons on his body. There are again Kumon Ryu Shishin versions, 2 of them. He was the most popular of those tattooed heroes. And as you can see, there are many others. And if you look at it, you can see that the tattoos are not yet in the completely symmetrical way as it became custom later. They were a little bit scattered over the skin, but they were almost covering almost the whole body. You can see these tattoos. And this led to a veritable tattoo boom. Now, who was tattooed? And it was in, first of all, those people who were working almost naked. I mean, those with a so-called fundoshi, which is a loincloth. And if you go to Japan, you know that the summers can be excruciatingly hot, and they didn't need any clothings, and they got decorated on their whole body. The size of tattoos can be different, of course. There are really full-blown body suits, if you want to call it that way, and they are called Soshin body or Senshin body. Again, I will move my camera and please have a look at how this is a full body suit. Here there are certain ways. This is called munawari, it's open at the breast, and even here how far it goes in or not, it's called hikae, is optional. And you can see here it can be cut off at the sleeves here, or it can go down the arm. How it ends, there are different ways to do it. Matsubagiri, for instance, or utsugiri. This is a sudden end. Here you can see how far it goes into the breast or not. And yes, so but the characteristic that you can see here is that a traditional full-blown wabori Japanese tattoo is always symmetrical and it goes over the whole body. And usually if you do a really big piece, it starts with the back and from there it is extended to the rest of the body. Now, there were all these workers like carpenters or people taking care of the horses, palanquin bearers, sedan chair carriers. It was a big clientele. The people who would now be called mailmen, those people who were couriers, boatspeople, scaffolders, and all those kind of artisans that were working with their body. And a very important clientele actually were the firemen, and the firemen, they were called Hikeshi or Gaen, and they were organized in guilds with thousands of them in Edo. You know, the substance of the Japanese traditional houses made of wood is very inflammable, and there were all again and again big fires in Tokyo, in the former Tokyo and Edo, and the firefighters, they were the people's heroes because they went and extinguished these big fires. And the firefighters, 90% of them had a dragon as a motive. The dragon is a mythical creature that can fly in the clouds, can call the rain, is the master of all the elements. It can also spit fire, and so on and so forth. So the dragon was their favorite guardian, god, if you wanted to put it that way. And it is said that most of the firemen were tattooed in big fashion. So were the scaffolders, the tobishoku, and many other artisans and workers. So the tattoo culture actually in Japan was a subculture of the urban artisans, and that should not be forgotten. Of course, there were certain other people from the underworld who very quickly detected those tattoos, because, as I mentioned, it was also inflicted as a punishment. It had this image of criminality attached, or of dangerousness, and it is said that some criminals have used the tattoo fashion in order to conceal their punishment tattoos, and also other underworld figures, bandits and robbers and so on, who got the tattoo in order to intimidate people. This is called Ikaku bori. And there were certain groups, there were the so-called machi yako. These were citizens who stood up against another group called Hatamoto Yaku, or Yako, which were, Hatamoto is a fairly high-ranking samurai class. These were samurai who lost their masters or were otherwise unemployed and started to roam about and steal and rob and do other mischief in the big towns. And those Machiyako, Machi is the town, they were from the artisan class or other classes and organized against those Hatamoto Yako. They were fighting for justice and they were defending the rights of the citizens, of the ordinary citizens. And interestingly, the Yakuza say that their forebears were these fighters for justice and for the weak and for the oppressed. And these Machiyako also liked to sport tattoos. there was another group of, let's say, dandies called otokodate in Japanese. They turn up in kabuki theater, in woodblock prints, and so on and so forth. These were people, young men who liked to dress up and parade in the streets, and they soon saw that tattoos also with their flamboyant designs were a nice thing to show around. So we had a really, really very, very big and very, very diverse clientele who got tattooed in a big fashion. The first sources about Japanese tattoos in Western languages are among them is one written by Erwin Belz, who was a doctor. He was actually the doctor of the emperor as well, and he was teaching at university, and he was practicing in Tokyo, and he had many patients who were profusely tattooed. He got very curious, and he wrote a very nice article about tattooing, very, very precise as far as the technical part is concerned, how tattoos are applied. And he estimated that at his time, that was the end of the 19th century, there were around 30,000 people who were full body tattooed in Tokyo only. So, and Isabella Bird, a lady traveler who traveled alone through Japan up to the north to Hokkaido. Yeah, it was one of these Victorian ladies who traveled around the world. She went, I think, to Tibet and Africa and in many other parts too. And she was in Japan after the Meiji Restoration, after the tattooing was actually prohibited. But she describes in her book that her rickshaw driver had these most beautiful tattoos on his back, dragons and fish motifs and stuff like that. So we can see that the prohibitions didn't work, yeah? And it was prohibited again and again, which is a sign that it wasn't followed, and tattoos flourished in the underground and were very popular among the working class. Well, now I will give you a small slideshow, so to say, about traditional tattooing from a book that was published in the 1970s. That means these tattoos are from the time after the Second World War. And I will, while you can watch these tattoos, I will talk about the technical aspects of tattooing. So now I show it from almost the start. So you have a big range of tattoos that you can see here, and I want to do it on 2 pages. These are, can we do that? Wait, no, I had that. Because this way we can't see the whole picture. No. Yeah, here we got all of them. Here we go. What only? Yeah, content only. No, this is this one. Anyway, okay. So, well, let's look at those figures here. You can see that are very different in design, and we've got these scary things, and it always, as you see, is symmetrical, and well, you can see that it really needs a good eye for designs. And listen, here are the carps, and The thing is that the tattooing in Japan has been in the hands of woodblock printers from its start. As we saw that the Suikoden heroes were very, very popular. And actually there are Suikoden heroes that are found again on the skins of people. And the big time tattoos, they were applied by woodblock printers. You have to know that the ukiyo-e, or those woodblocks, they were made in teamwork. So there was the one who designed it. For instance, Hokusai or Utagawa, Kuniyoshi. These are the big names that we know. But there were all these other workers in the woodblock print shops. There were the carvers who carved the woodblocks. There were those who colored them. There were those who printed them. And actually, when we go to the terminology of tattoos, the most, the one everybody knows is irezumi. Irezumi means to put in ink under the skin. But this is, strictly speaking, only the tattoos that were done for punishment. And other names for tattoos are bunshin or shisei, and this is the preferred term by the tattoo artists themselves, horimono. Horu means to scarve, to sculpture, to engrave. So this were the woodblock printers who were actually scarving the woodblock prints, who, as a side job, began to do the tattoos, which means from the very start of the tattoo art in Japan, it had a really high artistic and technical level. That means you see these very grandiose designs, and absolutely clear that this was influenced by the designs of woodblock prints. You see the very clear and flamboyant coloring, and which is, and I can show you maybe in some examples, which is actually characteristic for the Japanese tattooing, is the chiaroscuro. That means the shadowing of the tattoos. Yeah. And this comes from the woodblock prints. In Edo times, it was said that people who wanted a big tattoo, they went to a tattooist who was famous for the designs, and they would carve in, or they would tattoo the outlines into the body. The outlines are called sujibori, and this is usually the first step when you get a big tattoo. When you want a Japanese tattoo, you go to the tattooist, you have a consultation. It's not like a drunken sailor in a harbor who walks into a tattoo shop in the evening and says, I want an anchor on my hand, and it's done. With a Japanese tattooist, it's not so easy. He really wants to know if you are up to the thing, because it will be in your skin the rest of your life. You see these nice tattoos with figures, quite possibly out of the Suikoden, who are again tattooed. A tattoo in the tattoo, which is called Niju-bori or Futae-bori in Japanese. Very intricate designs. And, well, so they went to that guy who made the outlines. Then there was the tattooist who was famous for his beautiful and shrill and big colors. And so they went there and get it colored, maybe only the red. And the coloring was called beta. And the third step was the chiaroscuro, which was called Bokashi. And this is a technique that comes from the woodblock printing. And so nowadays, usually it is one horishi or tattooist who does everything. And in the end, he will carve his own name into the back of the tattooed client. And as I said, horimono is the preferred term, and the tattooist would be called horimonoshi or horishi. And in Kansai, they sometimes just say sumi, which means ink, or they say gaman, which means endurance, because it is painful, and call the tattoos gaman. These pictures that you have seen now and you see here are from a very famous Shintoist Matsuri, a festival called Sanja Matsuri, and that's where the Yakuza come and show off their tattoos. There are many people who want to see them. And there is also a pilgrimage site called Oyama, where people who come, organized in a guild of tattooed people, Shoyukai it is called, they go there regularly every year. And most of them are not Yakuza, but shokunin, or tobi shoku, scaffolders and others. Yeah? So here you see a Fudong Myo, this is a Buddhist deity, in Sanskrit Achala, who sports a sword and a chain, and is a manifestation of the canon, Avalokiteshvara actually, and he smites the bad and fights for the Buddha Dharma, and is a very popular figure among the Yakuza to be tattooed with. Yeah. So this is the Furin, wind god, and you can see that there are mythological or Buddhist motifs and others that are applied on the skin. And over here there's a mantram. And of course there are meetings of people who are tattooed that also had started in the Edo times, and so-called, well, nowadays we would call it a convention. And so these are older tattoos by different tattoo artists. And I can show you a few tattoos, modern Japanese tattoos. Now I have to do another comment, which is that at the time when I started to research tattooing in Japan, and when I got to know Horitsune II, there were about 300, estimated 300 professional tattoo artists working on the islands. And nowadays it is said that it is between 3,000 and 5,000 tattoo artists doing their work. So you can see that there is an enormous increase, and which does mean that, well, quantity does not always translate into quality. So you have all kind of tattoo artists. Some of them just do Western tattoos, small tattoos, fashion tattoos. Others who learn the trade in the traditional way and do the Japanese tattoos. So yeah, and as far as the quality, the design, and all these things are concerned, it is very, very diverse. I do not comment on the aesthetic value of these pieces, but you can see some are fairly manga-like or manga-inspired. Some are very, very shrill in their coloring, and they are usually not done in the symmetrical way like with the Yakuza. These are Yakuza tattoos. This is nice work. Here you got the Fudomyo again, and this is black work. So you have all kind of, this is some kind of tribal work. This is a guy who works with the hand. This is the traditional way of tattooing in Japan, is with it's called tebori, and you have sticks and there are needles attached. The tattooist, he produces his needles by himself, and there are some who only have 3 to 5 needles for the outlines, and others up to 10 to 20 needles for the coloring and stuff. And tebori is said to be fairly painful. There is tsukibori, which goes in perpendicularly for the outlines, and if you hanebori is when you do the coloring, you go in deeper into the skin. And so this guy is famous for his handwork, and as you can see, it is very delicate. And yes, so these are just examples of contemporary tattoos, and actually something people in the West don't know about, and we'll talk about that in my next lecture when I talk about the Japanese underworld. I'll show you something that will surprise you. I mean, most of them are not in circulation anymore because the Yakuza, the Japanese gangster organizations, are seriously on the decline. But this is one of those Yakuza fanzines. You have a lot of stories. These are all Japanese bosses. They have face and name and address in these magazines, and these are stories about these bosses, about altercations between gangs and so forth and so on. And particularly this one, Jitsu Documento, it was called. It always had in the middle a section with tattoos, and you can see that these tattoos, well, again, are of different quality. And here you have the telephone numbers of the tattooists. So this is a way they could advertise their tattoos shops. And many of those in their name have something like hori, which is a gesture to the tradition, because horu means to carve or to put in ink. Yeah? And but many of them are also called shodai, which is the first generation. Yeah? And well, anyway, tattoos in Japan have also become fairly popular among the in certain segments of youth culture. And one of the things that is representative for this is a book that was published a few years ago by Kanehara Hitomi, which is a young lady who had her tongue split and full-blown tattoos on her body, and which is a very, very realistic description of this underground culture of tattooing among young people. It was also made into a film, and this flick is extremely loyal to the original. The book is called Snakes and Earrings in English and was published in New York and London in Plume 2006. It came out in 2004 in Japan, and it won a very prestigious literary prize, the Akutagawa Sho. And it shows how far tattoos are already en vogue among young people, and certain cultures, of course, the rock musicians and the surfers and others who are a bit on the margin of the normal work market anyway. They liked tattoos, and the way how tattoos are perceived is quite different between the older generations and older generation and the younger generation. Of course, the younger generation is much more open, and yeah, we were talking about the tabooization of tattoos and why this was the case, and I will come back to that. And I told you that one thing was the punishment, or the penal tattoos, which had this, well, odor of crime and criminality. The other was, of course, that with the start of the tattoo fashion, the Yakuza, or later Yakuza, did the tattooing as well. It is can show off their masculinity and how they can endure pain and things like that. It's very showy, and yes, and it became a sign to be, well, outlaw or a rebel, and under the prohibitions, getting tattooed would mean that you are kind of, well, going against the authorities and free spirit and all these motives that made tattoos attractive on the other hand. And well, it has to be said that the bad image of tattoos is not as old as one might think. Well, the association with the Yakuza is there, but as I said, until the second or end of the Second World War, it was definitely a urban workers, artisans subculture, and it encompassed all kind of professions besides the Yakuza. And this changed in the 1960s, 70s. There is this book for all those who can read Japanese. I would recommend it. It is Amitoni Hanjin. It is written by Yamamoto Yoshimi, an anthropologist who formerly did a work on the tattoos in the southern periphery of Japan, which is quite interesting because the women in Amami-Oshima and further south in Okinawa, they used traditionally to have tattoos on their hands, and these tattoos are very similar to pictorial decoration you can find in some tribes in Taiwan, and maybe it came from there. This is worth to notice, worth to mention, because on the other periphery in the north, in Hokkaido, it was the Ainu, the indigenous people out there, who had tattoos and had them in their face. So it was very visible, and it was the women who were tattooed. It was kind of being recognized as an adult woman and being able to marry and all that. Rite de passage connotation that was there. And interestingly, there was also a case that went into the international press a few years ago. There was a Maori lady who is a famous linguist, and she attended a symposium in Hokkaido. And Hokkaido is the biggest island in the north, where the Ainu actually have been living since time immemorial, and the tattooed Ainu. And she was refused entry into a public bath because she had this traditional Maori moko tattoos, which are in the face as well. So the irony is that in the place where the women were tattooed in the face, she was refused to enter that facility, and that went through the press and also made the Japanese rethink about the cultural differences that are involved in the perception of tattoos. Here you have a photo of Ainu women who have their tattoos in their face. There were different patterns available. And on top, this is actually a so-called Sachiko Hanten, which is a fireman's working what do you call this? It's called of here you got it. This is Kumon Ryu Shishin, a hero from the Seikoden I mentioned with the 9 dragons on his skin, and this is on the firefighter's jacket. So you can see that the motif were found on the jackets and on the skin as well. Very similar in design and coloring and all the rest of it. So yes, and this Yamamoto Yoshimi, the anthropologist, interestingly, she chose Irizume for her title, which I wouldn't have done. I would have preferred Horimono, but since it is really the most common denomination, maybe it was her choice. And it is a nice description of the history, and as I said, her insistence on the fact that it is the culture of the urbanites in the late Edo period that was determining how tattoos evolved, and that it was the artisans and many other people who got skin decorations, not only the Yakuza, but in the 1960s and 70s, as I said, there were so-called ninkyo eiga. These are flicks about Yakuza, and depicting the Yakuza in a little bit of a romanticized version. And the most famous actors of the time, you might know Sugawara Bunta or Ken Takakura Ken. And interestingly, since these flicks became popular and you watch them, the Yakuza are always tattooed. But in older Yakuza films, there are quite a few of them, you can see an occasional tattoo scattered somewhere on the skin, usually among the gamblers. Yeah? A gambling scene, and they sit there in their loincloths and make their bets, and one or two of those gamblers have a tattoo somewhere. You go into the 1970s movies and look at them, all of them were tattooed. So the image of tattoos, or big-time tattoos, equal Yakuza, was actually put into the minds of the Japanese public through these films. That's what she states, or that's her thesis, and it is not totally to be denied that this is the case. And interestingly, the prohibitions to go to public baths with tattoos are not as old as we think either. That means this once this image or this prejudice that tattoos is something that the organized criminals do was established, it began in the 1960s, 70s, that 60-71, there were over 22,000 so-called sento. These are public baths where you can go and wash yourself and have a nice time. It was usually a place where people met themselves in the evening to have a chat or something, like the Romans liked to go to the bath to spread the rumors and all this stuff. And in 1993 it was only 10,000. In 2014 there were 4,542 public baths or sento left. So of course this has to do with the way people live now in apartments. They have a bath at home and all the rest of it. But the actually the entrance, it was around 30-40 years ago that they began to prohibit people with tattoos to enter those sento. And now, as I said, it is in discussion, and maybe it will change, particularly with the tourism and okay.